Welcome to ThinkTech Friday, part of the ThinkTech radio series on AM 760 KGU, broadcasting across the islands and raising public awareness in Hawaii. Now, here's your host, Jay Fidell.
Okay, we're back. This is ThinkTech Radio on Friday. Let's call it ThinkTech Potpourri Friday. Friday, of course, in French is jeudi. Okay, we're here with Robert Harris of the Sierra Club and Richard Wallgrove of Blue Planet Foundation. Here on Friday, we're going to talk about LNG, that's liquid natural gas, at the FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Did I get that right, guys?
Correct. Sounds right.
Say hello to the people.
Aloha.
Aloha, everybody. Happy Aloha Friday.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess the most important thing to talk about right now is what happened, this very week, within the last few days. It was reported, I think, in Civil Beat a couple days ago. And it is that while in, I guess it was August, the Hawaii Gas Company, the one company that's trying to bring liquid natural gas to Hawaii as an alternative fuel, filed an application for permission to do so with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington, D.C. Okay, you guys recently, I guess within the last few days, both the Sierra Club and Blue Planet Foundation filed briefs in opposition to that request made by Hawaii Gas to the FERC. And I want to know what's happening with that, why you did it, what you're saying. Give us a handle on the play that's going on at the FERC. That's why I call it What's Going On with LNG at the FERC. That's poetry, doesn't it, Robert? What do you say?
This is Robert with the Sierra Club, and so the application that the gas company, or Hawaii Gas, filed for was asking for three things. And the first part was to sort of bring in a small quantity of liquid natural gas under the assumption that they wanted a backup in case something were to happen, that they still have supplies of gas. But sort of mixed interchangeably in there was sort of the concept that they're going to start bringing in lots and lots of liquid natural gas for energy consumption. And so although the application on one hand says, well, we just want this phase one part approved, it also sort of interchangeably talks about a phase two and a phase three. And the application was really hard to break apart. It was really sort of asking for the whole enchilada. And in addition to that, they asked for a waiver from having to do an environmental review. So
a waiver of what?
Having to do any type of environmental review, so no environmental impact statement. And so part of our concern was if we let this go, they'd use it as a justification for bringing in liquid natural gas in perpetuity. They said, look, our application talked about everything, and we got a waiver from the environmental review, and let's go ahead and set up a refinery and start moving forward. And we really felt like a much broader discussion needed to happen, not only for the environmental reasons, but also for the economic ones. Does this really make sense for Hawaii going forward? Or should we continue our commitment towards clean energy and renewable energy in the manner which has been envisioned and talked about for the past decade or so?
So you come in as what, intervenors? What gives you standing to file this opposition?
Yeah, so we do have to, actually, the first hurdle is we have to intervene. So that's our motion's entitled Motion to Intervene, but it's also a motion, it's called protest, and our comments as well. Yeah. So interventions based on the fact that we're the largest grassroots environmental organization nationally, with a long track record on clean energy issues and gas in particular. And
you have hikes on Sunday.
We do hike Saturday and Sunday.
So thank you.
So, again, our focus here really is not only on the national environmental issues, but specifically also what's going to happen here in Hawaii.
So, Richard, is the Blue Planet taking exactly the same position, a similar position? You guys collaborate in putting this together? I mean, did you call each other up and say, I'm filing, why don't you file, or something like that?
Actually, no, we didn't.
Boy, what a fantastic coincidence. Eh?
We ended up having very similar positions. Not to delve too deeply into the legal arguments, the point Robert raises about they've asked formally for this phase one approval for small quantities of LNG, but part of the application is demonstrating that that's in the public interest. And they've used the ostensible public interest for the phase 2 and 3 to support this phase 1 request. And so Blue Planet Foundation's perspective is very similar to the Sierra Club's in that we think that local people really need the opportunity to examine all of these issues before we can get into phase 2 and phase 3. You can't separate the separate the pieces the way this application has tried to.
Well, it sounds like part of the commonality of the two positions is that talking to Washington, you have to let us sort this out locally before you just treat an application like this, because this may be different for Hawaii, and there are Hawaii-specific issues that have to be worked out in Hawaii. Am I getting that? Is that right?
I think that's plainly a part of it. Their justification was a fear that the refineries would shut down and they need supplies of gas. And so on one hand, it's a very Hawaii-specific issue. There's also very nationalistic issues as well. I mean, what are the impacts of fracking? And I know we'll dive into that a little bit more. What are the impacts on the amount of CO2 produced from burning gas? The energy cost of cooling volatile gas and making it this liquid is very high. And so reports have shown that the CO2 production is on par with coal. So I mean, those are very national, general issues, but they're also very specific local ones. And then also just the sheer cost of investing in the infrastructure to do gas in Hawaii. The fear is, HECO, or to the extent any, the utilities invest in this, there's sort of a limited amount of money that we have available for building up our energy infrastructure. And so if all that goes to building up LNG, then we're not really investing in the renewable energy, we're not investing in energy efficiency the way we should be. And the concern is once you sort of get a foot in the door, it'd be just the easy answer to say, well, we'll just do LNG for everything. And we really want to make sure we have a healthy conversation about that.
No, I mean, regardless of what's in your brief, which I actually could not read in that article for some reason, it doesn't come up when you click on it at the bottom of that article. It says the website's not available. You might check. I mean, I'd like to see it. Other people might like to see it. And how can they get your opposition right now? Can they go to your site, Barbara?
It was on the Civil Beat this morning when I checked, and so if you are a Civil Beat subscriber, they do have it attached as a PDF image. And obviously, if they want to contact us at our website, which is sierraclubhawaii.org, I'd be happy to send it out to anybody who's interested.
Okay, so on Blue Planet also?
I think Blue Planet's position is the same on that as well, although I'd also point out that the FERC docket is very easy to get into as a public citizen. Early in the process, I went in online, signed up for the docket, and I get all of the filings emailed to me on the day they're filed.
So you can see what all the other ones look like and model your pleading, right? You guys have not done this on a regular basis then. This is not your regular cup of tea to file oppositions in FERC.
Correct, and in fact, there's not many Hawaii-specific projects I'm aware of that are at the FERC level. Normally, on the mainland, since you have a lot of commerce between states and you have lines that run between states, FERC's very active on the energy scene. But here in Hawaii, since we don't have that, most of our energy projects go before the Public Utilities Commission. So some question was, why is Hawaii Gas filing this before the FERC? And I think we agreed and said, we think FERC's the appropriate jurisdiction for this. But still, it is kind of not many people in Hawaii have this experience.
That's very interesting. You're right. When you think about it, although we have representatives of the Federal Energy Department hanging around a lot, and they help us, we don't have a lot of federal issues. We do. It's mostly state law, state regulation, state action. So this is one of those exceptions to that. And I guess the reason is that it's an importation of the energy from the mainland, and that means it requires FERC approval.
And the construction of export-import facilities would also be.
Which become a federal issue because what? It's in federal commerce, in state commerce and so on.
Correct.
Very interesting. Well, the one thing that catches me, and I guess it's in both of your briefs, is the notion that we started on the Clean Energy Initiative in 2008, and everything, I shouldn't say everything, but 99% of everything has been directed toward doing renewable energy since 2008. This is a change to that. And as a matter of policy, I guess what you're both saying is that change is a change that, where the tail wags the dog, where we swallow our own initiative in favor of something else that just came in. And that's not a good policy to follow. I guess I hear you saying that.
I'd take it one step further. The FERC filing suggested that this importation of liquefied methane would actually bolster the state's clean energy goals. Not just that we're shifting gears and trying something different.
This is what Hawaii Gas is filing.
Correct. So this concept to me that that importing methane, a fossil fuel, furthers us towards our clean energy goals is difficult to swallow, and I think it takes an extraordinarily high burden of proof to show that that's the case, and that those are the studies that Robert mentioned.
But suppose I say to you, as Hawaii Gas would undoubtedly say to you, this is only temporary. In fact, Robbie Am, a couple weeks ago, made a statement in one of our programs on, we called it the also-rans. I don't know if you guys were there. It was about the ones that are not yet commercialized. And he said, well, LNG, there's got to be room for it, but only on a temporary basis. So I guess you have some trouble with that.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure the exact same thing was said 100 years ago about oil. And, the idea, if you go back and, Blue Planet did some excellent research about a year ago where they actually showed, paper articles talking about the need to move towards, cleaner, renewable energy. Oil was probably
it looked pretty good back then.
And LNG is the same situation. And, currently right now there's a glut in the United States. Both from overproduction, but also we've had unusually warm winters. And so it's at a very artificially low price point. It is going to go back up in price. In addition, the cost of building this infrastructure is very high. And some of the studies, tentative studies that come back, have shown that it wouldn't be any cheaper than oil is today for Hawaii to bring it in and to, the cost of doing the refinery, et cetera. So the concern here is really, are we going to invest so much money that we're locked in to the same problems that we have today? We're just switching from one liquid fuel to another liquid fuel.
This is like, forgive me, this is like the super ferry argument, that the super ferry is not feasible, okay? That it's going to cost too much to operate, there will be too many maintenance issues, so we shouldn't let them do it because they can't be feasible. I know there were other arguments too, obviously, but that was one of the arguments that I thought was interesting. But I hear the same argument through your comment, is that this is going to cost too much to stay within the rate structure that they would get approval for. I mean, are you saying that if it's going to cost too much, that rate structure simply will not work? And if the PUC, which would obviously govern the rate structure, would blow up. It just could not maintain the rate structure if the thing wasn't feasible because of the high cost of building the infrastructure. I mean, why are you concerned about their expense?
Well, and again, our primary concern and focus is really on the environmental issues, and so let me not leave off on
Understood.
that. But, the fact that there isn't any studies, isn't any analysis of this, isn't that alarming and concerning before we start moving forward with actual implementation steps of bringing in gas here? The idea of environmental review is to look before you leap. Before you make commitments that are going to wind up costing everybody money. You don't want to be halfway through construction of something where somebody finally says, well, wait a second, the rates aren't going to make sense here. So the idea is we're suggesting that this should be looked at and analyzed first. I don't think it's determinative, but it plainly is an important issue, isn't it? Part of the justification of bringing in gas is that it's going to save us money. And
that's the biggest justification of all.
And shouldn't that
and people are so interested in price now. We used to have the clean energy initiative. Now we have the cheap energy initiative.
Well, and again, the idea is that you really should have some analysis of that. I mean, what they're basing their analysis on is it costs this much on the mainland, so therefore it'll cost this much in Hawaii. And really, wait a second, that is such a stretch, right? I mean, the cost of building an export facility, the cost of having the ships to bring this over, the cost of having a refinery. I mean, just to give you an example, the explosion radius of one of these ships is estimated to be about a half mile. So
what's an exclusion radius? Just so the guy out there who doesn't know that term will.
Well, I use the word explosion.
Explosion.
So
I thought he said exclusion.
Well, thank you for clarifying. Because
we're talking about downright explosions now.
Yeah, correct. So I mean, the idea is when one of these ships come in and out of harbor, they shut down the entire harbor because they don't want a terrorist ship coming along and hitting it and blowing up and killing lots of people. So I mean, just to give you kind of an idea of what the physical infrastructure impacts are. What's been talked about, proposed here, is actually building something offshore with the idea that you're far away from a harbor. We don't have the continental shelves the way the mainland does. Nobody's ever built something like this before. I mean, these are huge endeavors, and it really deserves a stronger look before you start committing the state of Hawaii to move forward in something like this.
I think we should talk about what that stronger look would be procedurally, you know. We want public comment. We want the involvement of everyone who has an interest or a voice or some statement to make. But what is exactly the forum that would apply? If you had your wish on this, if we sort of held this in abeyance until, you know, the state of Hawaii and with all the, you know, stakeholders could get together and sort it out, where would that happen?
Well, again, there is a requirement on a federal level. You normally would have to do an environment, an EIS. And so that's one of the things that they explicitly asked for is we want a waiver from that. We don't want to have to comply with it. And so that's a big point of our brief is, no, wait a second, you do have to do that. And you don't just do it about the small amounts you want to bring in. You know, if the entire public interest justification is on the whole enchilada, you know, basically replacing oil with a different fossil fuel, then let's look at the whole thing and let's analyze it in a detailed fashion.
So if I'm the FRC, what you want me to do is hold it, just wait, or do you want me to deny it? I mean, I don't know what your brief has said or your briefs have said, or do you want to hold it in abeyance and wait for this process to happen locally, or do you want to deny it until the process happens and then require the Hawaii Gas Company to refile? What's your claim on that?
I think normally here they would deny the request for a NEPA waiver, National Environmental Policy Act, which is what's the trigger for doing an environmental impact statement, and say you have to go forward and do an environmental impact statement.
Okay, and I take it there is no environmental impact statement pending right now?
No.
And that statement would be for what? All of these various elements that you described, you know, between the ship and the processing and everything?
I think so. I mean, under environmental impact statements, you're not supposed to segment projects. I mean, the idea is, you know, from a developer's perspective, you may say, well, I want to build one house here, one house here, one house here. You know, you're segmenting it all up, when the reality is it's really a huge 1,000-home subdivision. And so the idea is here, we don't want them to segment it in tiny little pieces. We want to look at the whole picture. So we have a complete understanding, and that's something FERC can have in their hands before they make a decision.
Well, what about you know, the old problem, and we've had this conversation before, is that if you don't want something, just delay it, and then it goes away because the commercial interests involved, they can't they can't tolerate the delay, the expense of the delay. Isn't that likely to happen here? I mean, is that what we're really talking about?
I think that's a great question, but I think that's a great question because one of the justifications that's been promoted for importing the liquefied methane is the idea that it can help us avoid some of the environmental compliance costs we have with our current oil-fired generation. Those environmental compliance costs are likely to come up in the next, say, 3 to 5 years. Is it realistic to think that we can have a $1 billion infrastructure project in our coastal zone to completely transform really our energy infrastructure, and that there are going to be no delays that push us outside that 3 to 5 window? I think that's not a realistic view of the situation, irrespective of what groups like Blue Planet Foundation or Sierra Club do at the FERC level.
Well, let me take it. We're sort of talking about the merits now. It's okay. Let's do that. Let me take the other side of it for a moment. Arguably, proposition, we need to have something that will allow us to accept non-firm renewables. I'm sure you've heard this argument. This is probably in the original moving papers, I would imagine. We need to have something that will smooth the curve. Okay, and right now, what's smoothing the curve on non-firm renewables is, you guessed it, oil. And right now, you know, that's the status quo, and the status quo presumably is going to continue for as long as those generator sets operate, which, you know, I mean, people say they're old, but they may last for a few years. Okay, so the status quo is going to last with all the negatives that come out of oil until we find a replacement, or rather a complement, if you will, for non-firm renewables, which we have plenty coming online. How do you answer that? This could be helpful. It could be a cleaner burning fuel, okay, to help smooth the curve and make the system tolerate increasing non-firm renewables. So why don't we do it, say, with that limited condition? Can't we do that?
I'm glad that you're framing it in this way. What you're talking about is baseload, right? The power that we always have on all the time. The reason I'm glad you're bringing it up is because that's not what it's being called in these filings in other places. It's being called a backup power supply, a bridge to renewables. That's not it. What they've proposed is 400 megawatts of baseload power, a sizable chunk compared to the 1,200 megawatts we currently have capacity for today.
But 400 actually sounds like what I was talking about. You know, it just sort of steadies things, smooths them out. Yeah.
So, Robert mentioned earlier, we really want to weigh this concept of having 400 megawatts of fossil fuel-fired baseload versus other approaches to this holistic energy problem. For example, have we really maximized the ability to use something like demand response to make up or to reduce the amount of baseload we need? Demand response is this concept that the utility could shut down some of our non-essential power uses for short amounts of time, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and that would allow us to match our renewables to our demand at any given time. Until we've figured out how much we can do with demand response, or perhaps what we could do with electric vehicles, we could have hundreds of thousands of vehicles driving around the state that are essentially just mobile battery packs. Every time they plug into the grid, they could be providing small amounts of this firm dispatchable power, the baseload that we're proposing LNG for in this FERC application. So when we're examining the concept of bringing in LNG, let's compare it to those ideas, the creative ideas that are out there that might be less expensive, that might be more environmentally friendly, rather than just diving headfirst to liquefied methane.
You think that's what Jeff Michelina meant when he said it's only a matter of using your imagination?
I think those are parts of it. I don't know that Jeff is creative enough to have all of the ideas. I don't know that my imagination is big enough to have all of the ideas, but I think that there are a lot of smart people out there with a lot of good ideas that aren't part of this baseload world of energy production.
Yeah.
When John F. Kennedy was president, he set this audacious challenge. We're going to fly to the moon, and basically assembled all the smartest people together and said, this is what we're going to do, and we're all going to marshal our resources in this direction. Yeah. I think it's fundamentally a mistake to accept that, the representation that we need 60% of our energy from baseload power and 40% of it can be renewable, and that's it. If you simply accept that, then you're really not going to be, you're not striking an audacious, aggressive tone that, frankly, I think we need to do, looking at the world projections of where both oil and gas are going to go up in price. If you look at sort of our historical relationship with oil and what that's done to us, I think we have to be a lot more aggressive in trying to establish alternatives, which include, much like Richard said, storage options, trying to aggressively pursue energy efficiency, which is something really the state has not taken great strides in yet, and looking at a diversity of renewable energy. This is part of the justification for a cable, is to have a larger grid, and with a multitude of different renewable energies, they can complement each other. So, the wind may not be blowing at Kahiava and Maui, but it may be blowing somewhere else. The idea is that you can really be more aggressive here. Engineers, and I apologize if I offend any engineers here, by nature are relatively cautious folk. Utilities, by nature, tend to be very cautious, and you put together a utility engineer, you have a very cautious person that will not want to strike aggressively without decades and decades of research. I think Hawaii cannot wait for that and has to be a little bit more aggressive about setting its future where it wants to be.
And to tie it back into liquefied natural gas, if we install the infrastructure that will be with us for 50, 80, 100 years, I believe our world's going to look very, very different in 80 years than it does today. So
one way or the other.
One way or the other. So the base load paradigm by that time should be as old as the dinosaur.
Okay, but your comments on this question raise a much larger question, which I'm glad that we're here in this place to talk about it, and that is that the John F. Kennedy model, putting all the brains together, actually making it happen, sort of that free-thinking, collective, that creative group, the best, the brightest, all that. We have a hard time doing that in Hawaii. We have obstacles to that. We have governmental obstacles. We have this sort of natural natural opposition to what the other guy came up with, whatever it was, the Kuleana system. and I wonder how you see, me, I've dreamed of that. I've thought that from 2008, that we could get the best and the brightest in a room and we could make this happen. We could be way out at the front. We could find the best technologies, bring them here, make them here, whatever it takes, and do all of the things you're talking about and do them right forever for the world to see and admire. But that hasn't happened, obviously. So how are we going to get there, Robert?
Let me back up a second, Jay, and I just wanted to bring up one other point. I mean, you made a mention that this was a cleaner fuel. I don't want to let that pass.
Cleaner burning. I'm not saying it's not fossil, and I'm not saying it's clean. I'm saying it's cleaner burning. I know the word parsing you're talking about, and I'm on the same page with that.
Okay, and just to the extent that we're there's a life cycle analysis here too. It's not just what comes out of the pipe, but there's the energy that goes into actually converting it to a cold.
And you're going to take all that together.
Yeah, and so again, the overall analysis is that this isn't that much different than, for instance, burning coal, which on a national level, the entire nation's moving away from.
You're including processes that take place on the mainland, though.
Correct.
Not here. So you're looking at the larger picture of the entire supply chain rather than what happens here in Hawaii.
Which is correct, and obviously, the CO2 emissions from the fuel we burn, impact us whether they are emitted here in Hawaii or if they're emitted, somewhere else in the United States.
Okay.
So I mean, again, I just don't want to.
Okay. That said, why don't you come back to my point?
There's clearly a perception that it's quote unquote a cleaner fuel, and I just say, it isn't, and we have to recognize that. The challenge of trying to move forward with our clean energy future and trying to adopt that does require strong leadership. And we haven't necessarily gotten that from either, and it's a multitude. I mean, you have to finger point at everybody. And I'd say, in part, it is, a failure from a governmental level of really trying to articulate a future. I mean, as they move forward with the cable project, one of the biggest objections, and I think it's a valid one, is that there wasn't sort of an overall view of what we're trying to do. What percentages PV going to provide, what percentages energy efficient going to provide, and really what are those options and scenarios going to look like. And that is something that we have been lacking for quite some time.
You're listening to ThinkTech Friday, part of the ThinkTech radio series on AM 760 KGU. Now here once again is your host, Jay Fidell.
Okay, we're back. I'm here with Robert Harris and Richard Wallgrove. Robert Harris is with the Sierra Club. Richard Wallgrove is with the Blue Planet Foundation on ThinkTech Potpourri Friday, and we're talking about what's going on with LNG at the FERC. And before we went sideways, we were getting to a sort of larger question that if you say, we've got to solve this problem using all renewables and all new technologies, the problem of the baseload that Richard was talking about, how do we do that? Not necessarily a matter of substance, because none of us here are engineers, but as a matter of procedure. How do we get the apparatus, such as it exists, all the stakeholders, to do that John F. Kennedy thing that you were talking about, Robert? I mean, if that could happen, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
It would. I mean, plainly, this is an easy issue. And so, again, what I suggested to others, John F. Kennedy challenged us to reach the moon, put everybody together and said, this is the national priority and what we're working on. I do believe that we have an equivalent need in Hawaii. We do also have to enunciate sort of what some of the different options are and actually take the time to look at them carefully. And the problem is when we start trying to parse one out at a time, it is you don't have that broader picture, you don't have that broader context. And so, somebody could easily come to Hawaii and say, what it really is energy efficiency, and that's all we need to do. Well, realistically, you can't energy efficiency weigh all your demand, so, it's going to be an important part, and what are some of the other parts, and really have that analysis.
But the problem is it's a moving target. The technology changes. For example, just a small example, I went out 2 weeks ago to the roof of Whole Foods, where they, about this? They have something they call solar thermal, which is vacuum tubes that are much more efficient than the old the old thermal energy that you get like in a solar heater, and they use this to desiccate the air, which is in Hawaii pretty humid, into very dehumidified air. And if you have dehumidified air, then air conditioning goes down to less than half the cost. Okay, brand new idea. A bunch of guys out of Princeton came up with this. So, I mean, I'm not saying everybody runs to that side of the boat, but it changes the dynamic. This could happen on any of the renewables anytime. We're in a time when there could be disruptive technology come out of the boat. So how do you deal with that if you have an organization, a grouping, a decision process that is like on a straight track that cannot tolerate new, different, disruptive ideas?
I'm glad you asked that, because that's really important. I mean, much like your financial advisor always tells you to diversify, right? Because you never know. You want that. You want to spread your risk out among a lot of different financial sources. The same thing applies to energy, that we really do have to be investing and moving forward on a broad basis. It's not going to be all wind, for example. It's not going to be all OTEC, by itself. You want to be seeing all of these different sources going forward on a broad basis. And if one suddenly just becomes the more viable, the cheaper, the easier, the better, then absolutely you want to leave the space within the market for that to grow and flourish. And obviously, it's a competitive market out there. You're going to go for,
Everybody believes his product is the best.
Yeah. And so create that space. But also, much like the government's investment in silicon chips in California, early on is what sort of led to Silicon Valley today. And so part of it is also, I believe, appropriate investment at an early stage to sort of allow some of these things to flourish and to move forward. So even though PV, Robbie Alm was on a radio show approximately a year and a half ago and said, PV will never be a major player in Hawaii's energy future. And you look at it today, we're bringing on per quarter roughly 15 megawatts of power each quarter. I mean, that's phenomenal, and it's amazing, and we've got to allow that space to continue to go.
Yeah, well, that's true. But I would add that's a relatively recent development, and we're still at something like 65 megawatts total in PV out of a total baseload of. You're familiar with the baseload, Richard. The total baseload of what?
The total generating capacity is on the order of 1,200 megawatts for Oahu.
Yeah, baseload. But at the peak, it's like more like 1,800. Yeah.
That's statewide.
Yeah, right, true.
And again, there's circuits in Kauai that are now, at times 100% renewable. So I mean, Hawaii, unfortunately, because we're completely different than anywhere else, really. We are not connected through this large, massive grid. So we're going to be on the cutting edge on how much renewable energy can be brought online at any given point. And we have to somewhat embrace that and say we're going to go forward. We're going to really start trying to see, what are the limits to this? What can we do to make sure it's more stable? Putting storage packs on every transformer, et cetera, to try and make sure that we have this healthy, modern grid. And again, that goes to your underlying question, which is, how do you allow for future technology advances? I mean, the modern system is to have a smart grid with lots of small individual power sources. You don't have one monolithic, facility producing all the power. Because if you invest all the infrastructure in that monolithic facility, you're not moving off of it. That's your future.
That's true, but it's not unanimous, right? There are some people who don't want to be on that grid, who don't want to have a statewide grid. They don't want to share from their island to the next. So I mean, that's the problem. I don't see a one group, one brain trust, as in the JFK model, where everybody gets together and figures out the best solution. So it's everybody taking a Kuleana piece. And at the end of the day, my concern, and maybe other people feel the same way, is that if we get involved in contention over everything, but we don't have forward motion in the general initiative, then we spend our time in the Tower of Babel, rather than actually making progress. How do you see this going forward?
So, Jay, I'll challenge your assertion that there isn't a forum to bring together the best and the brightest.
Well, there's the Energy Policy Forum. Robert is a member, aren't you?
There's another process. There's a process going on right now, in fact, called the Integrated Resource Planning process that the HECO companies are required to go through.
Yes.
And the Public Utilities Commission actually has brought together 65 of the best and the brightest people in the community to help answer this question of how do we move forward. That process ends next June. But yet we've got this FERC application filed back in August, and that's one reason the FERC application was probably premature. If we go through that IRP process,
You would have liked to see the process happen before the application?
well, what I'd like to make sure we do is that we have this IRP process go through to completion, and we just recognize that if at the end of the day we decide that the only change that's right for Hawaii for the next 50 or 80 years is just to switch from one imported fossil fuel to another imported fossil fuel, we will have failed. If that group of the best and the brightest can come out of that with a new business model for the utility, with ideas about the technologies that can help us today and the disruptive technologies that might be in the pipeline for the future, and if in that process somebody demonstrates with some degree of quantitative definitiveness that there's a role for LNG to make this happen faster or more effectively than without the LNG, then I think we've got a FERC application in the waiting. But to do it now and for the top level of our state government to say that LNG is in the public interest before that process is completed is one example of where we put the cart before the horse.
It's hard, isn't it? Democracy is so tumultuous.
It is, and plainly, having that broad conversation, you're never going to have 100% agreement. You're always going to have outliers. But the idea is that going through that process, you do get community buy-in, community support over time. And the idea is also, you have the diversity. You look at Germany, for example, who is heavily invested in diversified PV on rooftops. And they overall love their electrical system. I mean, you ask them what they think their utility, and they say 2 thumbs up. You imagine that reaction here in Hawaii. And part of it is that they really did put an emphasis on some of the diversification, so people actually see, okay, I have that PV system, or I see that storage, that's mine, I get it. And their interest and support for the larger renewable stuff is also higher as well, because I think that they're a little bit more bought into the overall system.
It's a buy-in thing, yeah, isn't it? So that's the most important side effect, if you will, of PV, because it's your house, your investment, your power, and it makes you understand and respect and admire the whole system. So that leads to another question, and that is, where's the public on this? I mean, there's been a lot of stuff in the press about LNG, both ways. Well, I say both ways, but primarily it's positive about LNG. And there have been, check my recollection, but there have been positive editorials about LNG, all on the Rabiam kind of philosophy of it. We need it, but we have to make sure it doesn't take over. So where's the public on this? And where do you see a responsibility to the public opinion, if you could ever find what it really is? Sorry.
I think if you're judging the public opinion, I mean, what has come out so far has been a series of commentaries by either Hawaii Gas, advisor consultants to Hawaii Gas, or Rabiam. So I mean, I think there's sort of been a one-sided conversation to date. And plainly, by us asking that we do an environmental impact statement, it is we're trying to say we want a more well-rounded conversation. We want to make sure we're going through the pros and the cons, not just the pros. Looking forward, if somebody were to look at 2 things, one is, how much money do we have to invest in this infrastructure, and is it really in some ways closing out the clean energy future? I think you're going to get a lot of people saying, no, wait a second, this isn't a good option. And second, I think it's really important to say, I think it's a spirit of aloha. You don't basically destroy somebody else's environment for our benefit. There are some clear, serious, negative problems with fracking on the mainland, where from an air pollution perspective.
Hi, sorry, Robin. Are we on or what?
Yes.
We are. Okay, we're on the air.
Always a good status check. I mean, I think there has to be a healthy conversation about what's this doing on the mainland. So, where you have, people whose drinking water is fundamentally contaminated, where you have air pollution, where, the plains of Wyoming are dirtier than the air around Los Angeles. There's some significant concerns there. And I don't think it's Hawaii's attitude to say we're okay with destroying somebody else's environment for our economic benefit. So, I mean, again, I think when we have a healthy conversation about this, there's going to be some concern, and I think that's justified and necessary.
One of the points you guys made in the brief, I assume in both briefs, is is that if we have money to spend on all this infrastructure, Why don't we spend it on renewables instead? And my question right after this break is going to be, well, how should we spend that extra money? Where would you put it? Okay, we'll be right back after this break. I'm here with Robert Harris and Richard Wallgrove. We're talking about their opposition to the application for approval of liquid natural gas at the FERC in Washington.
You're listening to ThinkTech Friday, part of the ThinkTech radio series on AM 760 KGU. Now here once again is your host, Jay Fidell.
Okay, we're back and we're live. This is ThinkTech on Friday, Potpourri on Jeudi. That means Friday. Robert Harris of the Sierra Club, Richard Wallgrove of Blue Planet Foundation, who have filed an opposition to the gas company, the Hawaii Gas Company's application for approval of LNG, importation of LNG to Hawaii at the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Washington. So I guess, this isn't happening in a vacuum, although that may be a sort of a mysterious word to use in this context. This is happening in a national landscape in which only in the last couple of years, for a bunch of reasons, natural gas has emerged as a cheap and plentiful source of energy, and everybody on the mainland is excited about it. And new technologies are coming online, huge new investments are being made, new plans are being developed to use natural gas for the next hundreds of years. But it's not without some contention. You guys, are you aware of the contention? Do you have contact with that at all on the mainland about the landscape of LNG in general?
I can't say that I have contact with the contention on the mainland, but we certainly keep a close eye on it because it impacts the decisions we have to make here in Hawaii. One of the things that you said is that LNG has become cheap and plentiful on the mainland, and that's what the proponents of LNG on the mainland are touting. But we have to keep in mind that's only because right now there isn't any way to export the LNG from the mainland to other places. While LNG is cheap on the mainland, Japan is going through their shift away from nuclear power because of the tsunami, and their LNG prices are ramping up. One of the problems with importing LNG here to Hawaii is that I don't think it's fair to use the mainland price, because if you can put LNG on a ship on the west coast of the mainland and you can ship it to Hawaii, that ship can sail right on past to Japan. And so why aren't we assuming we'll have to pay the Japanese rate or the Korean rate or name some other Asian country? So you asked about what's going on the national landscape. And
can I go back to that for a minute? So why can't we have our own ship, which I think is in the plan for the Hawaii Gas, build a ship, not immediately, but in some other phase of this project, to just ply the trade between here and the mainland on gas, not go to Japan, not go to Asia at all. Just buy gas at the spot price in LA or whatever, or maybe it's in Portland or San Francisco. Why can't they do that and get the same price that some guy in Texas can get, rather than the fellow who wants to buy it from Japan, who is willing to pay a lot more because the current price for the Japanese is astronomical, and all over Asia it's astronomical. But why can't we have our own little niche market that's cheaper than the Asian market?
Well, I guess I'm just asking the question of why somebody would sell it to us if they can sell it to the Japanese for 3 times the price.
Okay, I understand. Legitimate question. We have to see the market turn on that, see what happens. Anyway, sorry. Go on with your point.
The national landscape, the debate about LNG, a lot of the talk has been about this energy independence, making the U.S. independent from other energy sources. And if that's a good reason to use LNG on the mainland, that's the perfect reason not to use LNG here in Hawaii, because we would not be energy independent if we were reliant on importation of this liquefied methane. So I think that national discussion actually can inform us about the decisions we make here.
Wow. There's a lot of arguments here, isn't it? It's interesting that this has been, until you guys did this, your respective briefs, this has been pretty much not publicly opposed. Am I right? And you didn't, neither of your organizations actually came out publicly to oppose LNG until now. Have you?
We've been asking these questions for some time. As the pro-LNG crowd has raised these issues, we've been trying to always wave the flag of, hey, but what about the real economics? What about the real environmental impact, not just of burning it here, but also of drilling it out of the ground in Wyoming or somewhere else?
So it's questions, but you'll agree with me that some of those questions, if not all of them, can be answered, and maybe we could even change your mind?
This is my personal view. If somebody can show me that it would get us to energy independence for Hawaii using local sources of sustainable energy, if it could get us there faster, I'd be all for it. I just haven't seen that yet.
And I think your original question was looking at what the national environmental
Yes.
viewpoint is. And just a bit of context, in 2005, under President Bush at the time, they pushed through what they call the Halliburton exemption, which basically allows for this kind of drilling to be exempted from the clean water, drinking water, clean air, sort of most of the environmental protections. So they're sort of operating in this void of regulation. And what the process is, they basically pump millions of gallons of water thousands of feet down below the water and sort of forcibly remove the methane out of the ground, but also by inserting this mysterious toxic chemical that they won't tell anyone about.
No, this
And-
is what helps in the fracking.
Correct.
Is
This-
it
this-
mysterious?
this is-
Nobody knows? Is it sort of like the secret sauce? What?
Essentially, yes. I mean, in fact, if somebody is hurt, and there are people who are going to the hospital saying that they are being impacted by this chemical, and the chemical is given to the physician, it's actually in the federal law that the physician must sign a confidentiality agreement and not tell anyone what the chemicals are that he's treating. So I mean, they're going through sort of a very extensive process to keep this whole thing closed, secretive.
On what basis?
Proprietary. They don't. The argument is it's proprietary, and they don't want to leak this out. That here's the chemical process by which they do this. But the reality is they're impacting everyone's natural resources, drinking water, environment. And so you're having these random wells with chemicals coming up that are being contaminated, and there's hundreds of examples of this. There's earthquakes now going on because you're shifting so much of the earth. Towns that haven't had earthquakes before suddenly are having them. These are major impacts. It's clear that we need to close up these loopholes and sort of make sure that if you are going forth it, that you're doing it in a clean fashion. But you also have to sort of look at what the national impact is by doing this. Much like the Deepwater Horizon, basically contaminated the whole Gulf Coast. Much like coal mining in the western part of the United States is destroying entire mountain ranges. This does have a significant environmental impact just in the extraction and bring it here, and we have to consider that too, because I think a part of being an aloha state is that you think through this process and you don't simply transfer your problems on someone else.
Well, as the resources of the state and the world, are used up, and we wonder about how our children are going to get their fair share and all that. Those arguments, make more sense. They're closer to us somehow. But what are you guys taking positive positions about? I'd like to know where you're pushing a given technology or renewable, where you're affirmatively supporting that renewable. You spoke about a statewide grid, and I'm happy to hear that because I believe in a statewide grid. But what about wind? Are you guys behind wind? Are you behind big wind? How about the guys on Molokai? Do you tell them to just sit down, relax? How do you handle difficult issues involving what might be a very clear benefit, in terms of renewables?
Jay, one of the things that the Sierra Club has done is we've taken the position that we want to see the environmental impact statement before we take a position on the wind projects. The idea is the environmental impact statement is supposed to show you what the biological risks are, socioeconomic problems are, et cetera. We sort of want to have that hard, objective look in our hands before we affirmatively say we support or oppose. And so,
Well,
to some
if you
extent,
find something you don't like about wind, you'll oppose it.
well, not necessarily. I mean, nationally, we have taken a very hardline position that we recognize that we have to be in support of some of these controversial renewable energy projects. And we've supported some, much to the disappointment of maybe some other environmental groups. Large solar grids on, the Moby Desert, et cetera. Kahiava wind farm project here in Hawaii on Maui, we were in support of. So, I mean, there are clear examples where we have said, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of good, and we've supported it. But again, a part of that conversation, you don't just blindly support every renewable energy project either. Plainly, they have to be well cited, they have to be well thought out, and we have to mitigate what the risks are. And so we're hoping to have that rational, reasonable dialogue. But the other things we're supporting, just briefly, and I'll cover them quickly, but for example, we've been big supporters of on-bill financing because we want to make sure everyone has the capacity to take advantage of renewable energy by having the funding and the availability to take
God, we're out of time. I'm so sorry. Can we come back and do more of this,
Okay.
We can follow on the FERC thing, but we can also talk about policy in general. Thank you so much, Richard. Richard Wallgrove and Robert Harris, thank you so much for coming down. Appreciate it. We'll do it again, all right?
Thanks, Jay.
Aloha.
Thanks,
Have
Jay.
a nice weekend. This is ThinkTech. See you next Wednesday for ThinkTech Wednesday.